Vincent from Molecule. Vincent.
Perfect. Can you all understand me in the back? Yes? Sweet. Yeah, so I'll just briefly talk about kind of lessons learned from helping create BioDAO, and we'll do the first part on just giving like a very 30-second intro on BioDAO, and then going into the lessons, and then leaving a few minutes at the end for questions. So for those that don't know it yet, BioDAO is a biotech DAO focused on funding and advancing longevity research. So we started, I think, 1.5 years ago, and actually what was funny was like I was kind of thought of doing like a science DAO, like way before I also met Paul and Tyler, and then found them via Twitter, and then they told me about the idea, so I helped to join to create it. So it was, yeah, and that's kind of like the model. You might have seen the presentation before, and kind of creating this sustainable funding loop of funding research, using the proceeds to fund more research, and in general, like not just fund research, but also, of course, really create a Schelling point and community for people interested in that space of longevity research to get involved and learn more about it. So I'll start, and actually I added like a lesson 0, which I thought was like almost like I assumed to be at the core of it is obviously that the core of a DAO is about the people and creating a strong community, and at the end of obviously it's creating a strong also scientific community that is positive sum, which I think might be different from other scientific communities, which might be more zero sum. And I think one core thing I realized is, of course, like the onboarding, that like a lot of researchers might not be crypto native, so but still really interested to get involved in a community. So I think it's really important to get the onboarding right and as easy as possible, and creating easy touch points to get involved, and even simple stuff like time zones. Like if there's like specific onboarding call that is always like in one time zone, but then like a whole like continent can't join because like there's never like a onboarding call in their time zone. Like even simple stuff like this, and really having people that that onboard other people. Like I realized this myself with like the greatest contributors usually joined because there was someone taking the time to get them involved, get them on the right project, and really empowered and also connected in that community, and giving them also a sense of ownership and rewarding them. Like I've seen this even myself in other projects where like people put in an insane amount of work and then like zero recognition, zero compensation, and like they were also quickly gone. And so I think it's actually really important to have this feedback loop and create like a fun also and high empathy engaging community. But so I think it obviously starts really with a clear purpose and mission, and I think like longevity is a good example of this, but I think a lot of DAOs actually lacked this, and I think which might be one of the reasons why a lot of DAOs died. And even though they might have had their meme moment, like buying the constitution or doing a specific action, it wasn't really long lasting and not a strong like long-term purpose and mission. And I think actually the crucial thing is to define it well. Like it's in a sense like having a sense of like what would success look like for the DAO. And I think a lot of DAOs I'm still talking to like can't really clearly communicate like what their theory of change is to an extent, and like what their well-defined purposes with like specific measurable and achievable kind of goals and metrics. And then I think the important thing is what I call definite optimism. It's like having a concrete vision of like what success looks like beyond just like pouring more money into funding. I think that's not usually what, like obviously it's like clinical outcomes, for example, in science DAOs oftentimes. And the second one is also keeping the focus on that mission. I think it's easy actually for people to get drawn into something like a BioDAO and then like lose focus of like the overarching mission and get like stuck in the minutia of like optimizing a specific small thing, but like completely forgetting about like not just like again like pouring money into research, but actually advancing the research. And I think it's not very impressive like to I think like failure would look in a BioDAO would look like having $1 billion, funding 1,000 projects and hitting 0 clinical outcomes. And I think it's like important to be explicit because like there are examples of organizations that had like successful clinical trials with like $1 million, and that is much more impressive to me than just like sinking a lot of money into research. And then of course really on that focus on the mission, like enabling kind of the high impact initiatives within the community, and really going for the underexplored, potentially impactful initiatives, because I think there's also this adverse selection that like probably the research that no one wants to fund like might have also good reasons not to be funded. Like what I mean is there's also obviously competition for funding. Like there is funding in longevity or neuroscience and all of these areas. And my kind of like default assumption is like the best research will usually end up getting funded. But so it's actually, one needs to look hard to find, I think, the worthwhile research fund sometimes. And then I think prioritizing high agency contributors that actually take initiative and have high intrinsic motivation, because it's also easy once you have a token and money that you're like attract mercenaries and not like missionaries who are actually in it for the mission. So that leads also to culture. So I think ultimately it's important to have like a shared values and like that also are enforced. That like if someone like breaks them, that they're like not like, and I think that's also like an interesting one, because of course you can't even like what's the right word, like kick someone out of your DAO to an extent because it's an open community, but there needs to be, I think, like a strong set of cultural norms that are enforced in a degree, and really that help to like create a strong scientific culture, but also like a culture of trust, because I think like there can be a lot of like people in crypto that like don't have the strongest values and that are not that strongly enforced actually. So I think it's actually even more important for crypto like DAO, which every science DAO is, of course. Yeah, and I think another important one on culture, I think, is really to like support like diverse set of opinions and backgrounds, and foster kind of like a culture of feedback. And then like one thing which I'm still which I think is like never-ending learning is like incentives. And I think a lot of people think like incentives is purely money, as like in this emoji, but I think it's actually just like one tiny part. I think actually a lot of the most valuable contributors, again, are like in it for the mission. And you can, of course, also, like someone who's really passionate about a topic, you can almost like demotivate if you introduce money as an incentive. So I think actually there's so many different kinds of incentives, and I think it's important to not just think of like tokens or money as an incentive, but also other ways to create incentives and reward contributors. Yeah, so I think the focus, and I think like Charlie Munger, like from Berkshire Hathaway, said it nicely. It's like if you can work on incentives, you should work on nothing else. Like in the sense, that everything is driven by incentives, like our scientific system, politics, like businesses, markets, and ultimately, I think the power of crypto is actually that one can re-engineer incentives, like even between, like going towards like public goods funding, and like there's novel ways to explore incentives, and I think it's something that we should, as a space and generally, explore more. Yeah, and then I think the main one is like clearly recognizing contributions is really crucial, because I think in a lot of other contexts, like maybe the PI or like the head like of the lab gets like a lot of recognition, but then like all the researchers in that lab that do the actual work like don't get really recognized, and I think it's also something where the DAO shouldn't be about a person or even like a few people, but it should really be about the people that contribute and that make it happen. And yeah, I think goes back a bit to culture, but I think it's important to have like this like clear, transparent, consistent policy of compensation. So it's like understandable for contributors like how incentives work and are enforced. And then yeah, the fifth one was what I also briefly mentioned before, is attracting kind of like the right people and really retaining them. I think it's really easy for to have tourists in DAOs that like just switch from DAOs to DAOs to see like where there are like opportunities to contribute, which is also fair, but like for the valuable contributors, I think it's easy to also lose them quickly again. especially in such a competitive space. Like literally we had like billion-dollar crypto projects like compete for our talent to an extent. And then you also see then like kind of like the people that are really in it for the mission, like are easier, harder to poach away than the people that like are in it potentially also for like advancing the career and whatnot. Yeah, so I think this point on like focusing on people that are really intrinsically motivated. And I think the core is of course that like at the core DAO can be a positive sum environment. So I think it's important to strive towards that and like remove the blockers and politics that can quickly bubble up in bigger DAOs. I think actually like that was like also core learning in retrospect is that ultimately like a DAO is really like not able to make a big impact without legitimacy and awareness. So I think like to an extent can of course be engineered, but it's also like actually much harder to engineer than I think most people assume of even like just getting the right people involved for the right reasons that bring on the other right people that bring on other right people. And I think we had this early on that we had like I think in the first month that we started our second Aubrey and Vitalik kind of like respectively I would say like the two most well-known people of the fields of like crypto and longevity to an extent join us for an interview, and that kind of like brought just like a lot of awareness, but also a lot of people becoming aware that this is even a thing and join in to help make it happen. But I think they only joined because they knew people that were involved, and they only joined because they knew the people that started it. And ultimately, it's this chain of I think legitimacy that people can underestimate. Where it's like sometimes hard to break into if one is not, for example, deep in crypto or longevity. It's harder to build up this web of contributors. And I think the core lesson there was also to an extent leverage existing communities. So for example, we engage fairly deeply, obviously in that sense, with the Ethereum community, with the like the whole community that Aubrey and others in longevity had, but also, for example, with the Reddit longevity community, we engage fairly deeply. And I think like a lot of DAOs that I see are like not getting to that like traction of like engaging these big communities and getting them involved. And yeah, I think it really also goes to awareness. And how much time do I have left? Okay. Yeah, and then the other one is on moving quick and adapting and iterating, which I think is of course like a classic also startup learning, but is ultimately I think also the big potential of a DAO that one can run a lot of experiments and ideally like learn quickly, improve, and do new experiments. So I think it's, of course, on every kind of aspect from DAO governance to the research, important, I think, to like not get overly hang up in discussions. Like I'm oftentimes just like literally talking to no one, just like putting it on the governance forum. Then it's like, okay, like it goes up on chain next week. And then I don't even need to discuss to people. Like it will be discussed in a forum with like everyone that wants to discuss it. But it's a very nice and straightforward way to avoid kind of like the inertia and slowness sometimes that even like creeps into like a big group like this, where it's like sometimes easier to build consensus in public because then people like have a more refined actually way to improve a proposal than having to convince everyone. So I think that goes also in this direction of breaking up proposals, of course, which are the heart of DAOs, into very small proposals that because sometimes it can happen that like people just like throw in like 20 ideas in like one proposal, and then I'm like, okay, like I don't like some of these ideas, so I'll vote no. But if it's like break up into smaller proposals, it might be easier to get to the source of like what people agree with and what they don't. So I think that's also like I did this in other DAOs where I just like did a proposal and like suddenly the whole like developer team that is building it like reacts and then goes up on chain like 5 days later and something happens. And it's like much harder to do that in the, of course, real world or companies. I think that was like a great blog post, which I think is also important lesson and learning that like DAOs are obviously not corporations or companies. So Vitalik did this blog post with the same title, and I think the core there, or the core learning, is really that it shouldn't, and obviously usually doesn't have like central like leaders that can make decisions. Like it's ultimately up to the community, which I think is even different from like shareholder capitalism in a sense, like Facebook, like Mark Zuckerberg is still calling the shots with his like voting shares and whatnot, even though it might have some like resemblance to DAO. It usually doesn't in practice, but on that one, I think the core is really on focusing on enabling the small, empowered, and autonomous initiatives. And there's like a great related blog post called Outcome-Based Resource Allocation by Peter Pan, who's like also long involved in a lot of DAOs, that he wrote for SafeDAO. And that point like what is the core insight there is that ultimately you have, similar even like to a company, you might have like a goals, mission, and metrics of what success looks like, but I think different from it, you have specific strategies that might achieve that. For example, strategies to advance or solve longevity, and then they are broken up into kind of smaller initiatives that like individuals could take on. So it could be like scientific communication to spread awareness on longevity, and then an individual could come in to propose an initiative for that. So I think there's like a nice visual to resemble this, that there can be these like independent pods to drive specific initiatives. Yeah, so I think then that was like actually what I just mentioned here is that it's important to, of course, strive to be as open and autonomous as possible, like the A and O in the DAO. And ultimately, that everything that can be fully transparent and open should be, and having like clear documentation as well as like these very clear processes that also really enable a DAO to become increasingly autonomous and also decentralized. Ultimately, I think a lot of them like start out, obviously it's like a very small group of people that like starts to maybe initiate a specific DAO, but I think it should strive to create processes where it's not centered around specific people, but where it's like really as autonomous and decentralized as possible. Yeah, that was a short one on like, of course, there's like regulations and risks. So I think it's important to read up on them and to ensure compliance, even though like the asterisk, I think is to an extent, like, I think a lot of things also wouldn't be possible if you were like asking every lawyer in the world, like you would never have created Ethereum or Bitcoin or like even Airbnb and Uber if you would have asked every regulator. So I think one needs to, of course, like be compliant and everything, but also I think another important one is to have really strong security measures also for the community, because a lot of obviously scientists and stuff like might not know of like the huge amount of like scams and social engineering attacks, and we even had like the most sophisticated people in our community get like scammed or phished that were like early in Ethereum. Like it's very like there's a huge, especially once there's like a honeypot of like a lot of money and like a lot of contributors, there's a huge incentive obviously for scammers and others to get involved. So it's important to educate the community, especially if they're non-scientific. Yeah, this one is on just making sure that DAOs is accessible and inclusive. Really on not being overly elitist and just enabling crypto people to join, but also really people that are completely new, even to longevity or to crypto in our case. So I think it's important in that sense to break down the barriers to get involved. Yeah, and that's my last one on that it's important that ultimately DAOs win because they are positive sum and like co-owned and driven, and I think ultimately it's hard to compete like say in our case collection of like 7,000 members with like a company of like 2 people. Like it's I think that's the power that like needs to be of course like reinforced by really putting people at the center of it, and yeah, having this like intentional onboarding and really bringing people on from just being curious to being more involved. Perfect. So yeah, that was the summary of the points. And if you want to join us, obviously the links are kind of like self-explanatory, but I put a link tree here. And if we have maybe a few minutes for questions, can also ask any questions.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for that. That was super interesting. So yeah, any questions from anyone? No?
You get to catch this if you have a question.
So I've got one. You were sort of talking about BioXYZ as a place for BioDAOs to come and sort of flourish. Are you doing cohorts, and how do you sort of see the relationship between these BioDAOs that are coming to you asking for advice? Is that sort of as like another layer of DAOs? It's like inception of DAOs, and do you find that the communities between each other help each other in that sense?
Yeah, so kind of like with BioXYZ, we are funding BioDAOs with like $100,000 and hands-on support in kind of like these cohorts, a bit like a Y Combinator for DeSci and BioDAOs. And I think the core insight for me has been really that a lot of the stuff we built on BioDAO, for example, like the tech side or the legal side, the governance side, is obviously replicable to other scientific fields. But I think a lot of like there's not huge value in like reinventing the wheel on stuff like building 10 different like ways to view like the DAO's treasury or something, or like but it's a tech effort that like if you do it once, you can use it twice. So I think like the goal is really to replicate this and then just enable like the DAOs in our cohort to kind of like fork it. But like everyone in the world, like we basically open source, like it's on GitHub, like the whole VitaDAO tech infrastructure and other things. And the goal is, of course, also on the legal front, on the tokenomics side and others, to open up kind of like the playbook to that people can like really focus on the science and like building the scientific community and research. So yeah, we have the next cohort, I think, in June. So if you're...
Well, there you go. The one you start buying now. So that's like just infrastructure and advice really for people that are interested. Super. Well, thank you so much, Vincent. It's a pleasure having you. Oh, cool.
Oh.
Thank you. I just have a question. On the voting methods, have you found any sort of best practices and learnings on voting procedures, what you have in terms of quorum and thresholds that you have to get over, what's worked, what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so we have, I think, like a threshold of like 5% of the total votes need to at least vote for quorum, and I think that worked well. I think there's like other, like ultimately I think the core with a lot of these things is just like observing like all the governance experiments and other DAOs and like what works and what doesn't, kind of like which patterns emerge, like delegation, other things. So I think we like continuously improved and like took those into consideration and also want to like explore novel ones, like even like quadratic voting and other things. But I think a lot of it is also like still very early and unproven. Like if you look at like all the DAOs, like they basically are pretty much all the same, like from their approach. So yeah, we definitely like incorporated a lot of learnings and improved the governance process. But ultimately, you can read up also on it on gov.vitadao.com is like the governance forum, which has some of the details. Yeah, but we raised actually the quorum, and for example, now I really focus on delegation and then like onboarding the right researchers, but also ensuring that they actually get a ton of tokens delegated to, so they have like a decent vote. But it's really like a lot of these small experiments just on governance, and then ultimately we have like half a person on governance, so it's like not sometimes enough people to like do a lot of experimentation, but yeah.
One more from me as well that I just thought of. So obviously Molecule are very large players in this space, and so a lot of these learnings come from them and yourselves and the learnings from BetaDAO as well. Do you also sort of reach out to other projects not necessarily affiliated to Molecule or that specific ecosystem and sort of speak with them about how they're doing and what works best for them as well as your own sort of personal experiences? Yeah,
totally. I think it's like to an extent so early in the sense, like we want to, for example, also, as you said, like we're talking to a bunch of them. I think we probably talked to all of them by now. And ultimately, also through other initiatives like GitCon DeSci Round or like BeakerDAO and other things, like kind of like ideally enable and fund all of them, like including like events and everything, and then really also enable them to like just use, like fork all their learnings and insights and frameworks, even if they completely want to go their own path. And of course, even like in a distributed way, like which is also interesting, like we can also obviously contribute alongside others in DAOs, but the goal is really like on BioXYZ itself, like to decentralize it. Like So the mechanism is kind of that the BioDAOs, like a VitaDAO or like others in the program, also have an ownership in the collection of DAOs. So they can, for example, take on tech initiatives together. Like if they need like a new BioDAO voting system that like costs whatever, like 100K of tech work, they can split the cost between all of them. So the goal is really there is to have these, exactly. That's kind of like the goal, to really drive down the cost, because I think a lot of BioDAOs couldn't afford to do like a lot of bigger tech experimentation if they all team up and like pool the costs. So
Brilliant.